do you think, Mr. Pollack, how much will it add to the already hyper desire to have arms race in the region?
Well, the arms race is an interesting metaphor, we might say. We have to ask questions about what that kind of a dynamic is. I do think, very frankly, that if you see North Korea able to sustain and advance its capabilities, its strategic capabilities and so forth, it will heighten very much the attention on the part of other East Asian powers to how they credibly protect their own interests in this context. That would include, frankly, not only South Korea and Japan, but also China. If there are risks here of a conflict of one kind or another, that states have to protect themselves and their own security interests. So this is what's missing in Northeast Asia, the idea that you have some kind of a common framework within which all involved powers understand each other, understand their intentions, and can be frank with one another about how they approach issues of long-term security. It's really a missing part of the story right now.
Mr. Yang, Mr. Pollack is pointing your direction, China. So is China doing an arms race as a result of what's going on in North Korea?
No, simply because China is not level with the two Koreas. China indeed are forced to be involved in the, to some degree, arms race, a strategic arms race with the United States, but at the strategic level, because our security pressures are mainly from the United States, not from the North Korea or South Korea, even from Japan, no. But in terms of the current nuclear situation, what we concerned more is the probability, increasing probability of the nuclear proliferation from North Korea to South Korea to Japan, even more. So that is a nightmare for China. We are closing by nuclear powers, and also we are seeing the approaching of the collapse of the global NPT regime.
That's right. Well, Mr. Felgenhauer, Russia is also a party in the six-party talks, but at the same time, Russia probably is also listening very closely when President Trump from the United States were suggesting not long ago that the U.S. is adding much more of its defense budget for nuclear issues and also for anti-missile development. And he's talking about what's going on in North Korea and, quote, other factors as well, end of quote. It's no secret that Moscow and Washington have not been on good terms for some time, particularly given the recent drama. So what do you think, how Moscow will react to both the rhetoric and the possible actions of military buildup in the United States?
With Russia and United States right now at very bad terms, both sides, or at least Moscow, has been falling back to kind of zero-sum game principles. And if something's bad for America, well, most likely that's not so bad for Russia. Though, of course, in the Korea issue in particular, Moscow is going to be doing everything to keep a common position with Beijing. That's the most important thing, because if our relations with America are so sour, we need to maintain relations with Beijing. And actually, Russian diplomats and many in Moscow are not happy voting for the last resolution on sanctions on North Korea, but since China agreed, we had to carry on. So that's going, and of course, there's going to be a beefing up of American missile defense capabilities in the region, and most likely not only in the region, and that is not very good, though it's not an immediate threat. American missile defense capabilities are limited, but still it's a potential threat that the Russian generals don't like at all.
All right. Mr. Pollack, I used to quote up Mr. Trump earlier when asking a question to Mr. Felgenhauer. But at the same time, your allies, South Korea, Japan, as a result of what's going on between US and North Korea, are also asking maybe they should develop their own so-called nuclear program because they don't trust the United States as the ally to save them. At least the US is already dragging them to the current situation. So what would you say?
Well, I think this is where, ironically, there is a clear parallel interest between the United States and China. And we can put Russia to one side just for the moment on this, although you could add Russia to the equation as well. The U.S. has absolutely no desire, no interest in seeing South Korea and Japan openly pursue a nuclear weapons option, because not only would that be a fundamental breakdown in the non-proliferation regime, it would also be a fundamental breakdown in any concept of a regional security order in Northeast Asia. That is not in America's interest. I don't think it's in China's interest. I don't think it's in anyone's interests. But states will do what they can if they feel their own interests are not being protected. So that's one of the dilemmas right now. China objects very vigorously to steps that the United States undertakes to augment its defense relationships with South Korea and Japan. But South Korea and Japan have legitimate security concerns, and if the United States is going to avoid a situation where we see more evidence of moving towards a nuclear option in either of these places, the U.S. has to forestall it by its own actions and commitments. Now, I should emphasize, I don't think that right now either South Korea or Japan is openly moving this way, but there are voices in both countries that are talking about those needs, and frankly, that's one of the real danger points in regional security. So we could be, if we do not handle this situation carefully and effectively, we could see ourselves on the cusp of a real, potentially very worrying transition.
Well said, Mr. Pollack. Mr. Yang, I have to go to you. Your other two colleagues were all saying, well, maybe, you know, China and United States share the same goal, that you don't want South Korea and Japan also to have nuclear weapons. Well, you have the same goal. And then Mr. Felgenhauer, coming from Russia, say, well, maybe we're not reluctant. We're reluctant to do something, but, you know, we try to abide by the principle to work with China. So if China agree with it, we try to be your partner. It seems that everybody agrees with China in that regard, quote unquote, but actually China is being cornered in a very difficult situation as the Chinese see themselves. Mr. Yang.
Yes, we are indeed in a difficult situation, like dilemma. The difficult situation contains two kind of challenges surrounding China. One challenge is from North Korea. Say, we insist on denuclearization, and North Korea under Kim Jong-un has permanently and strongly pushed their nuclear ambition plan. And the other challenge from the United States, say, we want denuclearization. US say, yes, we want denuclearization either, but China say, we want the solution through the negotiations. And we need the pragmatic approach, and the US say no. For example, China made a proposal, freeze for freeze. US say no. And we say some other proposal, US say no. And only we received from the US often is no.
Okay.
So such a no from North Korea and a no from the US always make China in a very difficult position.
So what are you trying to say, Mr. Yang? Is the US in a way strategically thinking of dragging the situation to a circumstance that it itself would take advantage of it militarily to have even more deployment in Northeast Asia? Is that what you're saying? Are you saying that the United States and North Korea unconsciously or consciously seem to even work together to certain direction to make the situation ever worse so that they can have their purposes fulfilled, Mr. Yang?
Well, let me put it back this way.
Okay.
We have a complex relations with every player, and North Korea, frankly speaking, enjoy to some degree the differences among the parties. So China always try to keep making proposals, although we fail again, and we try again. And now we are open, say, if our proposal, for example, dual suspensions towards dual track negotiation,
right.
If some parties say, no, it's not good, and we open say, okay, we can give up the proposal, but please raise your replacement, your counter proposal as a replacement. So that is such a complicated situation.
Do you have, then, I got your words. Do you have, Mr. Pollack, a counter proposal, a new proposal besides the UN Security Council resolution of sanctions after sanctions?
I don't think that the United States would be intrinsically opposed to particular discussions, if not overt negotiations with the other parties and even with North Korea under some circumstances. The problem, though, is that we see in North Korea a state that shows no desire whatsoever to engage in any kind of relationship with the United States and others, all others. Its doors are closed. And so therefore, under those circumstances, states are doing what they prudently think to be necessary to protect their interests, or their interests of allies, or their self-interests. That's not an optimal solution by any stretch of the imagination. But I would argue that fundamentally the first goal has to be the avoidance of a conflict. The avoidance of a military conflict which would have profound effects and not in good ways on the future of Northeast Asia. It would affect all the countries of Northeast Asia in very, very damaging ways, and it would have unpredictable effects. And first things first, I guess I would say, and the hopes that over time North Korea arrives at a more realistic understanding of how its own long-term interests would be best served, but we are not at that point. We're far from it.
Mr. Felgenhauer, what is Russia doing at this point when all the parties are in very hot debate as to what to do in Northeast Asia? Can Russia afford to be one of those players in the region that just wait for things to happen? What else can Russia do? Well, your American counterparts are building up their missile systems, further their nuclear systems, and having Northeast Asian countries possibly also go into an ever-escalation of their preparedness militarily about something what they fear as the North Korea might do. What would that mean for Russia?
Russian kind of ruling elite hopes that by kind of the Trump's policies that are not very well defined and often rather awkward and aggressive, the United States may isolate itself in this North Asia region, or maybe internationally, and that, again, in the context of a zero-sum game, that would most likely be seen in Moscow as good. The Russian main strategic interests right now lie, of course, in the West, in Ukraine, in in the Baltics, maybe in Syria. Korea is not seen as a direct possible threat, and even a military conflict in Korea would be, of course, very dangerous, but Russia would do its best to stay aside of that. So that's what right now the Russian policy is, to wait for American mistakes, exploit American mistakes. Of course, we're supporting the six-party talks. We're coordinating closely with China and hoping that maybe Washington is going to break its neck there.
All right. Talking about Washington, Mr. Pollack, I still have to have your analysis. It is a divided Washington we are talking about. There's no solution, we all know, no common consensus, but are there some solution proposals cooking up right now that might be able to gain eyeballs and even some votes? Eventually, that would help to resolve the situation. Military buildup is not the solution, as you may know, Mr. Pollack.
I think it is imperative that the Trump administration begin to act in a much more coherent and organized fashion on these issues. Policy cannot be made by random statements from the president. There has to be some degree of a common view, which I don't see right now, and it's very distressing. I mean, for all of the United States' power, we see a situation where now, more than 6 months after President Trump became president, there are any number of positions that are vacant. We still, even in the midst of all of this crisis, we still have not named a new ambassador to the Republic of Korea. There is no Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs. There is no Assistant Secretary of Defense for East Asian Affairs. There are, and you cannot expect to develop coherent and effective arguments with allies and with others if you are so incapacitated at that level of the leadership. So I'm saying this as an American. It's very, very distressing that we see so little attention to this, and frankly, even major cuts in the State Department budget. It just simply makes no sense.
Okay.
Believe me, I am not alone in this perspective.
You're not. We know that, Mr. Pollack. Before we go, Mr. Yang, very briefly from you, 30 seconds if you can. Divided Washington, divided Northeast Asia. What can China do?
Well, continue to explore the new proposals that can be accepted by all the parties. Say, we have got a very tough sanctions on North Korea, and then we should turn to the other focus point, say, cooperation among the parties to open the dialogue way.